Hello, everybody. Welcome to our November meeting. Got a really good lineup, three papers today. So here's the parish notices. 7th of December will be our next meeting, obviously the last of the year. We've still got one place vacant if somebody wants to volunteer something or even half a thing. We're happy to have work in progress short reports. We got a bit of room in December. If anybody wants to join us, that's 7th of December. Then next year, we've got a special treat for you, although this is a bit provisional, but the first three meetings of the year, 11th of January, 8th of February, 8th of March, now, all this will be on the website, of course, will be a mini conference, because quite a number of us, as you'll probably know, have been involved with the American Folklore Society annual meeting. We just finished their virtual meeting. A number of our old friends who are here today and some who aren't gave virtual papers at that meeting, but of course very few of you will have heard those. So we're asking them to repeat them as our next three sessions, January, February, March. The difference is that we'll have 4 papers each afternoon, so the timing will be different. So please, when you get the message about next year's events, have a good look at the time, because they're going to be starting and finishing at different times. But I assure you the papers are well worth coming for. And we thought, well, why not put them out over here as well as in the States? Anyway, so look at the website or read your newsletter about all of that. And then the other things, my God, we got a lot of things planned. We got our Broadside Day in Sheffield on the 14th of February. That's the annual Broadside Day. And the Women and Folk, I keep getting it wrong, Women and Folk conference, in-person conference in Manchester, 18th of April. So there's no getting away from song research for the next 4, 5, 6 months, people. So that's it of the parish notices. We got 3 good papers, as I said, in order. We got Paul, Mansfield, Vic Gammon, who you know well, both of those. But we've got Steve Thompson. It's his first time with us, so again, be kind. And we'll start off with Paul, if he wants to share his screen. I can't see you, Paul. Oh, there you are. And don't forget to unmute.
Yep. Okay, screen share coming up, hopefully. And then slideshow to come.
Yeah, that's there.
Go on, slideshow.
I'm on slideshow.
How's that?
Yeah, that's fine. Take it away.
Okay, well, hello everybody, whatever time of day it is you're listening to and watching this. So I'm going to be talking about the Blind Beggar's Daughter ballad this afternoon. I'll say hello from the East Midlands of England, like I usually do, but it's more relevant to today's topic to point out that I grew up on the border of the county of Essex and the east side of London, which is where this particular ballad is set. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be briefly refreshing or introducing to you, if you don't know it, the main characters and themes of this ballad. And I'm going to be talking about the potential connections with the social history of the different eras the ballad travels through, because this is quite an old ballad. I think we can prove that it was published in the late 17th century, and it might go back further than that as well. So I'm going to start by talking about the kind of views that used to be quite prominent in ethnomusicology in the early days of the discipline. And they tended to be quite a hard view in the early days of ethnomusicology, that you could map the content of musical pieces and musical performances against the social structure and elements of the culture in which the music was produced. Now, I don't think you hear that kind of hard version so much now, but there's certainly a suggestion that there's a strong link between music and the society in which it's produced. So I'm going to be looking at that in a kind of historical way today. And I will leave it up to you to decide whether the link between the ballad and its various eras are just a connection, or whether it says more about social history than that. And the particular problem or angle we've got with The Blind Beggar's Daughter is, of course, that it's a very old ballad, and it originated in a society that was very different from the societies it was subsequently published and sung in. And one thing that goes along with that might be that publishers saw the fact that the ballad was old as the selling point, and therefore, in a sense, it became disconnected from the society in which it was newly produced or newly performed. It was using its antique element as the selling point. Again, nothing I can prove or disprove about that, but those are kinds of questions that hang behind the presentation, I guess. So I'm going to be using two versions, a very long version in Percy's Relics, 67 verses, published in 1765, and I'm going to stop my consideration in 1820 with a version published in Liverpool in that year, which is the version I'm most familiar with because it's the one I sing. So when we go up to 1820, so the basics of the plot is that the blind beggar's daughter leaves home. She's courted by various suitors, but most of those drop out of consideration because her father is a blind beggar. And then when she finally meets the right chap, he goes to meet the blind beggar, and lo and behold, the blind beggar isn't really that poor. So in a sense, the virtuous suitor is rewarded for his virtue. So I'm going to start with The Blind Beggar's Daughter. Now, you'll be fascinated and less than surprised to hear that this particular image comes from a genre of literature and art called fantasy. Who would have guessed it, eh? But I think there is a point about this particular image, perhaps not so much to do with the young woman's appearance, but where is she sitting? What might be her employment situation? What's implied by the setting of this picture? And that's something we'll come back to very shortly. So how is she described in the ballad itself? Well, in the Percy version, she's got a couple of problems. She's already in employment in this version, but she suffers from being too damned pretty, poor girl. And this causes a problem with her employers because their other employees, possibly their sons, are very attracted to Bessie. But of course, the employer knows that she's from a poor family and it would not be a suitable match. So she picks up on this jealousy and prejudice and asks her father and mother to go away, further away to seek a fortune. In the short version, unsurprisingly, there's less detail. There's no evidence that she's actually in a job at that stage. There's no mention of a mother. She just wants to go away and seek her fortune. So in that particular version, you could say that we're having described to us a more ambitious and possibly feisty young woman. So in one version, she's in employment. In the other, she's not, but she's looking to make her fortune. So what are the links with the social history around women and employment at these points? Well, we're talking about basically the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. And throughout that time, there was increasing female participation in the labour market outside of the home. There was work that could be done inside the home. Perhaps the caricature or cliched example, the stereotype would be spinning and weaving, which does come back into our account later on, actually. But generally speaking, there's a rising female participation in the non-domestic labour force, and that accelerates, obviously, towards the end of the period we're talking about. But what were these jobs? These jobs, particularly in the early part of the period, we're looking at the jobs as servants, which could be domestic servants, or they could be working in an inn or something like that. And there were some aspects of that kind of employment that were a little problematic, a little dodgy. We all know from folk song, don't we, what happens to the young and naive chambermaid who carries a candle to light him to bed. So there's this issue about being in service as becoming sexually available to people who are using the premises. So potentially a bit risky, a bit dodgy. So one way out of that, of course, is to get married, preferably to somebody who has a good income, or at least a sustainable, a reliable, regular income. But in doing so, women, of course, lost many of their rights as independent individuals. And you can trace that through the 18th and 19th century with various pieces of legislation. The other thing which I think is very relevant to the narrative of the blind beggar's daughter is this interplay, conflict, tension between marriage for love and marriage for money. I mean, that goes back a long way in stories. And marriage for money is not always seen as a bad thing, but it's got to be the right fella with money. So it's okay to marry for money, providing it's a person of the right character who's not going to treat you badly. And when we get to the end of the period I'm talking about, we are into the era of Jane Austen. And people who are familiar with the novels of Jane Austen will definitely have a view about how important that kind of thing is to her stories. Okay, let's move on to the blind beggar. So how is the blind beggar described in the ballads? Well, ballads are usually a little bit light on the use of adjectives, as are many other types of folk song, with some exceptions, those that perhaps came from the musical theatre, the pleasure gardens and end of the market. So two extracts here, the one on the left, the first one being from Percy, of course, and the other one being from the 1820 version. So one particular adjective that occurs several times in Percy's version is the adjective silly applied to the blind beggar. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of the different meanings of the word silly, in which I'm not an expert anyway, but I would offer to you two potential meanings or connotations to the use of silly as applied to the blind beggar. So one of them would be that it means insignificant. It's not important. Oh, don't worry about my father. He's just a blind beggar. So that would be one way of reading that phrase. Another way of reading it would be that silly means innocent or not blameworthy. The blind beggar's not a crook. He's not a criminal. He's not a fake beggar. Although given the way the story ends in most versions, you might argue that he is a fake beggar, but I'm not going to go into that. Then the second quote from the Percy version, this particular suitor loathes beggars. He doesn't just dislike them, he loathes beggars. Now, in the 1820 version, again, because it's much shorter, the use of adjectives is almost not there, and there's no particular description given to no adjective applied to the blind beggar himself. But the same problem, first suitor, you're not fit for me, no blind beggar's daughter, my lady could be. What then is the social history around begging? And I think this is fairly complex in quite an interesting way, actually, because beggars, not just in Christianity, but in other religious traditions as well, are seen as, at least sometimes, worthy of giving alms, giving charity to. So they can be seen as deserving people, but they can also be seen as undeserving and a nuisance. And certainly if there's too many of them around, the forces of law and order, the government are likely to see them as a social and economic threat. If you can beg, you're removing yourself from the labour market, more important at times when there are labour shortages, of course, and bands of beggars could become a source of insurrection. I've certainly seen it mentioned about particular panics around ex-service men roaming the country when wars finish and that kind of thing. But the other thing about this beggar is also blind. So this adds some further layers, because as begging has ambiguity, so blindness has ambiguity. So blindness can be seen as, oh yes, somebody's blind, that's unfortunate, they deserve charity. Again, thinking of the period we're talking about. But it can also be seen as you're blind because you're a sinner. That idea appears in Christianity, and in the sense of karma, I suppose it appears in other religions as well. But then there's also this other cliche going on, again, over many centuries, of blind people having some kind of special insight. They might be prophetic, source of special wisdom. So I don't think we can get away without using the modern term otherness here. So I think if you've got a beggar and the beggar's blind as well, there's quite a lot of different things going on. It's quite layered. The other thing I want to mention before moving on is that social attitudes to begging can tend to harden up at times of economic stress. And you could probably, to some extent, over the 18th and 19th century, map how hardening attitudes to begging, and indeed to poverty in general, relates to how the economy is doing and that kind of thing. But that's not all there is to it. We know from contemporary society that politicians might want to make their name and think they can garner support from bashing particular minority groups. Quite a lot of that going on at the moment. So that's another influence on attitudes to begging and governmental action against begging. And also there can be tensions between central and local government. Does local government want to crack down on poverty more so it doesn't become an economic burden on the parish? Or is it central government that's worried about the threat of violence, and which local bodies are going to be keenest to implement harsh measures? From what I've read, the key thing you want to avoid if you're a begging is you don't want to be situated in a town governed by Puritans in the early age of Puritanism. They tended to not be very keen on begging, to put it mildly. And of course, there also can be conflicts between secular government and religious authorities in terms of who's got control of this sort of thing and who's going to crack down the most. Now, that's covered the blind beggar's daughter and the blind Beggar. So I'm now, if memory serves me correctly, going to move on to the subject of place. And this is going to be a particular delight for people who take an interest in sophisticated geography. There you go. Probably the most sophisticated map of London you will ever see. For those of you who are not familiar with London, the River Thames is running west to east on the horizontal, more or less in the middle of this. So, taking account of any roughness in the cartography, the area we're talking about is the top right-hand corner of the quadrant of what is Greater London nowadays. For all of the period I'm talking about, almost all of this top right-hand corner would actually have still been part of the county of Essex. It would not have been counted as part of London at all. And indeed, on the outer part, where Romford's situated, Romford being next door to Hornchurch, my hometown, hence my interest in the ballad, really, that area was not absorbed administratively into London until the mid-1960s. But that's the area we're talking about, and the distance we're talking about there is about 12 and a half miles. So how does that play out in the ballad? Well, we know from the Percy version that Bessie is more or less running away to seek her fortune and get away from these jealous housekeepers and other employers. Now, you might think that in doing that, she would turn further into London, where she would have more employment opportunities, greater anonymity. But for some strange reason, she turns east or northeast. Firstly, arriving in Stratford, which is not very far from Bethnal Green, and then keeps going until she arrives in Romford. Possibly a strange choice. And then when she finally meets the right sort of chap, he's described as a knight in both versions, actually, and they go back to Bethnal Green from Romford to meet the blind beggar, her father. It's interesting in that version and other versions I've seen, Romford is described as somewhere that's full of knights and other nobles. Well, yeah, okay, maybe. So the geography is a bit strange. The direction of travel is a bit strange in that version, but not as strange as it is in the 1820 version, okay? Because apparently the blind beggar of Bethnal Green is living in Romford, because we know that Betsy is living with her father and she wants to go and seek her fortune. She walks out of Romford. So the mystery here is, why is the blind beggar of Bethnal Green, presuming he's still begging at this point, giving himself a 25-mile round commute to go begging? Not impossible, but you think, why? Okay, so obviously the direction of travel was later reversed when she meets the suitable suitor, the chap who's not insulted by the poverty of her father. They walk out of London and go back into Romford. So frankly, it's all a bit peculiar. But what were these places in the era we're talking about? Well, for much of the period we're talking about, starting circa 1700, Romford would have been bigger than Bethnal Green. So it was a historic town of West Essex. For most of this period, it would probably have had a population between 1,000 and 2,000. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. It goes back a long way. It's a fairly significant place, but I don't think it would actually be full of the nobility, which is one way of reading the description of the suitors in the Percy version. Bethnal Green, by contrast, in the early part of the period, is a village. It's close to London, and it does have agriculture, which becomes more systemized into a market gardening type arrangement as the population of London grows. But then when we hit circa 1750, 1760, the population sizes start to flip to a very great degree. And Bethnal Green becomes urbanised, it becomes industrialised, it becomes a big place. And for some reason that I'm not entirely clear about, weaving, which was always present to an extent in Bethnal Green, as it would have been in many smaller population centres, weaving becomes really important. Bethnal Green is not that far, I suppose, from the traditional weaving centre of Spitalfields in East London. And it isn't the case that all the Spitalfield weavers moved out to Bethnal Green, but there seems to be a proportionate shift there. And in terms of the connotations that Bethnal Green would have had for the audiences of the ballad, by the time we get to the end of our period, 1820, it's arguably the most densely populated place in the whole of England, with pockets of extreme deprivation. So for those who were aware that that was the case, very, very different connotations to any connotations Bethnal Green would have had in 1700. So we've discussed place a lot in traditional song forums. We know that naming places in some ways has a kind of token function. It's to make it sound as if this thing might have happened in a real place, rather than usually describing that it actually did happen in a real place. And place might also act symbolically. So in the later period, for example, you could say Bethnal Green is standing in as a representative of an urban area and an area affected by poverty. But I would argue that the important thing here is who is the audience. So the amount of evidence we have about who the audience is for ballads, either in a printed sense or in a performed sense, over time is limited. It's not that we've got no evidence about that, but it's limited. And there's also a geographical aspect to this. Now, ballads were pretty well distributed. I think the modern thought is that they went a long way beyond the main urban centres. And if you lived a long way from London or Essex, you might not have the faintest idea what Bethnal Green and Romford were. But that could change. That could change over time as people travelled more, as people became more educated about different areas of England. And of course, the people who lived locally in London or Essex anyway, they would know these places. The other factor, of course, here is that Bethnal Green would have acquired some kind of notoriety over time. So just moving on to sum up then, you can't avoid the fact that if a ballad or a song exists for 200-300 years or more, what's described in it will either change, either the ballad itself will adapt, or society has changed in a way that leaves the original meaning of the ballad, in a sense, stranded in the past. But what I think we don't know is how much people in the past read into that sort of stuff. So what I've done today, in effect, is I've demonstrated what I'm interested in the ballad and what it says to me about connections with English social history. But other people might be less interested in that, or they might focus in on something completely else and completely different in the ballad. But what I would say is that ballads are a good way of having a starting point for investigating history. And I hope, certainly the case for me, and hopefully it's the case for some of you, that if you carry out this sort of investigation into a text, it firstly helps you or gives you a better appreciation of the ballad or some of the alternative meanings of the ballad, and it also develops your appreciation of social history, gives you a way into some of those issues. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was an excellent start to today.
I now need to unshare, don't I?
Unshare. Everybody.
Where's the unshare button?
We do have a very few minutes for questions or comments if anybody wants to preferably raise your hand by going down to the reactions thing at the bottom there, because I can't always see everybody on the screen. So David, you've got
Yes.
your hand up.
Steve, before you cue in David, have I successfully
No,
shared?
no, we can still see the
Dear.
sharing. But we can talk while you're doing that if you
Yeah,
don't
sure.
mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let David go ahead, and I'll do my best.
David.
Just a bit of added background. The ballad seems to be a kind of condensation of an episode from the story of the Blind Beggar of Bethnal Green as a play called The Blind Beggar of Bethnal Green of 1659, possibly a little bit earlier than that, because the author John Day's date is question mark, died in 1640. So, but it's an episode in the story of the blind beggar rather than specific, not concentrating on his daughter. I don't know what you'd make of that. There's also a chapbook version of the entire story. But I can't really shed much more light on it than that. That's just a quick bit of online research that I did while you were talking, while I was still listening to you.
Right, David. First of all, have I managed to unshare now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hooray. Yeah, well, I have actually got on my shelf a copy of or a Blind Beggar play. It's one that's not an early version of it. I think it's from around about the same period as the Percy ballads. Actually, it's a British Library reprint. So yeah, the relationship between the play and the ballad is an interesting one, because obviously some other things happen in the play. The version I've got, there's these two rogues trying to kidnap and ravish the daughter, is one of the things that happens in that play. I don't know whether we can really ever get to the bottom of exactly how the play, assuming the play did exist first. That is, of course, that is perhaps an assumption, although we can only find a printed version of the ballad.
From the evidence we have, that seems to be the case.
Yeah, certainly we've got printed versions of the play before we've got printed versions of the ballad, yeah.
And of course, the play would be more London-centred than the ballad would necessarily be, because like you said, ballad could be distributed, whereas the play would be staged in London.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but that's certainly an interesting dimension, yeah.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth.
John Baxter's got his hand up. John?
Yeah, it's just we're always struggling with the possibility of hidden meanings, and it might be Bethnal Green because Bethnal Green was the subject of a joke in the fashionable London theatres, and everybody knew it. Or it might just be that Bethnal Green happens to begin with B, and it could have equally been the Blind Beggar of Bishop Stortsford or the Blind Beggar of Barnsley,
or Barking.
Or Barking, which is more geographically nearby. Yeah, I mean it's one of the joys and horrors of looking at these songs. Is seeing that it's come from a play, and it's been written to be inserted in the play, actually changes. Well, for me, changes the way you look at a song, and you have to think about it a bit differently than it just being a piece of text floating in the air that tells us about history. It's equally a piece of text that tells us something about how theatre was operating in the 1650s, if I get the date right. And that's an issue right into the middle of the 19th century and beyond. Is suddenly finding hidden meanings that can completely change the way you think about a song.
Yeah, well, I think there's something about the origins of songs there as well, isn't there? Because we may think we know the origins of songs from the earliest printed version that that survives. But of course, the key word there is that survives, because we don't know whether other versions have been destroyed or lost or whatever. But yeah, I think you're right. The idea of a kind of archaeological dig back into the origins of a ballad is definitely another way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to move on. Thank you, Paul. Well, one small comment. The reason why it's not the Blind Beggar of Bishop Stortford is because you can't rhyme Stortford as easily as you can green. So I think green a pretty good bet. Anyway, we're going to move on. Thank you, Paul, and comments from everybody. We're going to move on to Vic, who's going to take us to the northeast, not the northeast of London, but the northeast of England.
Right, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share the sound. Share. So can you see something of me?
Yeah, it's
okay.
Very strange looking.
It's an abstract piece of art by Annie Dearman. It's not what we're talking about today. Oh, I'm on the wrong page.
Right, so we had origins, yeah.
Okay, so play from start. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is really I mean, the lovely thing would have been if Susan was here to present this herself, but she's not. She died a few years ago. But give you some background. I met Susan in 2006, and she attended a lecture I gave on broadside ballads at the Lytton Phil in Newcastle. And later, I'm going to get Sheila to read Susan's words, which I've put up here in purple, just to give you some variety and to differentiate what is my meanderings from the actual quotations I'm going to use. This paper is an attempt to just give you a flavour of her work and to direct you to it. So later Susan wrote,
I recognised the possibility of exploring more formally the songs which I enjoyed.
Now, when you acquire a research student in a university, they're usually sort of pretty green in the gills, but Susan wasn't. She came amazingly well qualified. She had a PhD and a very high level music qualification. She was an licentiate at the Royal Academy of Music, which puts my O-level music into something of a context. The MLit degree, it was a 2-year sort of minimum degree, ideal for people like that who really, didn't have to do those deadly research training courses, which often are totally irrelevant to what the people are doing. But she really had a good idea. What she was able to do was to spend a lot of her time getting a good contextual knowledge of the period and the place. And so I'm presenting this work in order to really encourage you to read Susan's work, and I'll give you directions on how to do that later. I'm also illustrating it by a few of the local sources that she used. So, Tyneside Song, I just picked up Alan's Tyneside Song, which runs to 500 pages, and Joe Wilson's songs, which runs to 450. It's a big subject. I think that's what's frightening about it in some ways. There's an enormous lot of it, but we can divide it into two categories. The phase one, the early publications, that consists of the publications put out by Newcastle printers. Newcastle was an incredibly important place for printing and for cheap printing. Angus, Fordyce, Marshall, songwriters like J.P. Robson, and the first group of collectors. Now, don't imagine Cecil Sharp, although John Bell in some ways gets a bit close to him. But people like Joseph Ritson, who produced various books on the songs and poetry of the Northeast. There's an interest in local culture. The second phase is really the great age of the Tyneside Music Hall. George Ridley, I went to Blaydon races, was on the 9th of June 1862. That's about the centre of the period. And famous stars, Ned Corvin, Joe Wilson, so on and so forth. These are, if you like, codified, brought together in the publication of Alan's Tyneside Songs. But Susan's work deals with this earlier period, and she wrote,
There is a substantial body of songs depicting a wide range of female experience.
So the problem of then and now, which Paul has actually very interestingly raised already, but this is Susan on it.
Recognizing the potential for a modern bias in analysing the songs, the project has examined them under 6 subject headings drawn from Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. This work, published in 1792, challenged prevailing constructs of femininity.
So we take 2 points from this: the importance that we don't just impose modern ideas using our own assumptions. Just look at the way that words change their meaning. We say, "I'll do that presently," and it means you're going to do it a bit later on. In Shakespeare's day, that would mean at once. A total reversal of meaning. And so even in the smallest vocabulary, there's a problem. But I also think there was a brilliance in using Wollstonecraft. She is both contemporary, 1792, and a critical voice in the period. And again, on the right, where you see Robson's Songs of the Bards of the Tyne, early publication that's absolutely in Susan's period. So why do we study song text? Well, we've just spent half an hour looking at one song, and I've spent years and years looking at songs and really getting a great deal out of it. They're interesting in themselves. They give insights into the prevalent attitudes and ballads, but there is a problem around, our understanding. Are they reflective? Do they just tell us something about the time and the period? Or are they actually constitutive? Do they sort of influence the way we think and the way we feel about things? I think that's a very interesting problem, and there's no simple answer to that either. Here is something Susan wrote.
Reflections on the findings suggest that it is reasonable to believe that the songs were likely to have had some influence on the attitudes of those who heard them, and in the light of the themes of the material, that this would reinforce the stereotypes of the time.
Okay, so an outline of Susan's work, this MLit dissertation, is a very good introduction. I'm not even going to try and summarize it because it really deals with some of the problems of working in this area very well. So I would commend you to read it, and you can get it off the website that we're going to give you details to. Then 6 chapters on various aspects of women's life, and then a very good reflection and conclusions chapter. 2 appendixes, one on the Pitman's courtship, which you can see is actually in this collection of Newcastle songs that I've shown us the front page of, printed by and sold by J. Marshall in the Old Flesh Market, 1824. And Elsie Marley, very famous song, a comparison of two texts of that song done at different periods. So the period that Susan covers really is the great period of economic and social change and of people's experience of that change. I mean, the development of something of a northeast consciousness. I mean, it's the region, it's the significant region that's furthest from London, the metropolis of the north, a sort of regional capital. I mean, I think living as I do in Hexham, the 2 big cities near here are Newcastle, obviously, and Edinburgh, much nearer than any other English city of comparable size. And we have a real problem of terminology. I keep telling people we ought to go back to those old problems of terminology: folk song, traditional song, vernacular song. I just think that if people are using this material, if it's popular, if it's accessible, if it's widely available, then it's interesting, whatever we call it. It's also a period, of course, that saw the French Wars of 1790 to 1815. You've got population growth, you've got urbanization, you've got both economic stimulation and instability. Now Newcastle is a centre, obviously, the coal trade. It's a centre of engineering. It really is a very important part of the world. I mean, and the connection, of course, with London is via the coastal coal boats, which usually took passengers as well as when Buick, the great illustrator, went to London, he went on a coal boat down the east coast. But it really is connected in that way. This is something Susan wrote.
I have decided to write about songs available to people in the northeast of the period 1790 to 1850, which seem to me to address the issues under consideration and which I have found interesting and appealing. Analysis may not be capable of generalization.
So she's not claiming any great breadth to what she's doing, but she's looking at the focus. There's plenty of work on the economic social history of the Northeast, relatively little work on the women of the Northeast. So it's interest in local culture is an important thing. It really starts to get a consciousness that seems to separate it from London.
The culture of the Northeast includes elements of independence and cynicism about the capital, which were expressed to varying degrees at different times.
Well, I think we certainly live in a time when elements of independence and cynicism about the capital are pretty rife in various parts of England. It's interesting in the use of dialects. Some of the songs use them, some of them don't. But I don't think that's as important as some people make out. I think it's, you could sing a song in dialect even if it was written down in standard English. But a lot of the songs are about the experience of working class people, whatever the audience was. So the use of Mary Wollstonecraft, why use this interesting and radical figure as a sort of key into, we've got to use something. If you don't use anything, you're just using the categories that are in your head. So Susan tries to really get around that a bit by adopting some material from Wollstonecraft.
There are some facets in the way in which Northeast songs represent women, which are very familiar and which seem to echo female experience in the 21st century. While this is interesting, and indeed sometimes shocking, it is important that I avoid the temptation to assume that because things look the same, they are the same. To help me with this, I have used the work of Mary Wollstonecraft, writing in 1792 to create a model for grouping and then analysing the songs.
This comes out in the first chapter. She's very clear on the problems of investigating historical material and a need to at least to try and approach the late 18th and 19th century mind in terms of the understandings, categories of language that they use. I watch quite a lot of television drama, and some of the modern stuff really doesn't have much understanding of, say, the period I know well, like the 1960s. There really is so much misinterpretation, which just happens through the passage of time. And I think it was an inspired decision for her to use a contemporary but radical and critical text in the way she used it. Some reason. So the 6 themes,
The themes arising in Wollstonecraft's work are also reflected in the lives of poor women, as the songs to which I will refer demonstrate. I have used 6 of the themes from A Vindication as signposts for the subject matter of relevant songs. The characteristics of acceptable female behaviour, the necessity for marriage, the risk and ease of seduction, earning a living, domestic responsibilities, civic activity.
Okay, so let's deal with, I'm not going to try and do a thorough summary of Susan's work. That you can read it, and I want to encourage you to do that by just giving you some samples from it. So, woman as an idealized object, Bonnie Mary of Argyle, you've heard songs like this. Girls had to be
docile, contented, prudent, and domestic.
So what women could do in public, there was quite a restricted range of activity, but there was interest in transgression.
Deliberate defying of convention, or an unplanned fall from the idealized picture?
That's a very interesting theme. I mean, a lot of song actually is to do in some ways with transgression, a lot of storytelling. Susan uses real cases to illuminate the song texts drawn from newspapers and other sources. But the fact was there weren't many realistic alternatives to marriage for young women. And of course, the danger of making the wrong match, just making a very bad marriage, were there all the time. And in fact, some of the songs deal with domestic violence. I've put the Sandgate Lass's Lamentation up on the right-hand side. I'll just read the first couple of lines. I was a young maid truly, and I lived in Sandgate Street. I thought to marry a good man to keep me warm and neat. Some good like body, some bonny body, to be with me at noon. But last I married a keelman, and my good days are done. So there's sort of uncompromising regret there. Okay, I don't think it's right to do a presentation on music without hearing some music. I want you to listen to the full version of Bonnie at Morn, sung by Ingrid Temple from Biker. And so certainly a northeast voice. The left-hand side, you see John Bell's manuscript of about 1810. It took the committee of the Society for Antiquities about 70 years to get it all published, but there we are. You see a page from the Northumbrian Minstrelsy on the right. So sit back, it's going to take 3 minutes and we'll listen to the song.
The ships in the meadow and the kies in the corn, those were lying in thy bed, Bonnie at morn. The ships in the meadow and the kies in the corn, those were lying in thy bed, Bonnie at morn. Canning at night, Bonnie at morn, those were lying in thy bed, Bonnie at morn. The bird's in the nest and the trout is in the burn. Thou hinders thy mother at every turn. The bird's in the nest and the trout is in the burn. Thou hinderest thy mother at every turn. Canning at night, Bonnie at morn, those were lying in thy bed, Bonnie at morn. Where all lit idle we are keeping o'er the ben, the lad will at work and the lass will not learn. Where all lit idle with a keeping o'er the ben, the lad will at work and the lass will not learn. Bonnie at night, canning at morn, those were lying in thy bed, Bonnie at morn. Canning at night, Bonnie at morn, those were lying in thy bed, Bonnie at
Okay, what I want to do is to just give an illustration of the subtle way in which Susan deals with this song. Not all of it by any means, but this is what she said. Here we are. So there's an ambiguity in this song. It's a lullaby on one level. It's 3 verses and a refrain, and it doesn't appear in print, as I said, until the 1880s. And I think that's pretty much the only source of the song. It's been quite recorded since, but this is Susan's comment.
The mother is singing to her baby, but her lullaby is interspersed with injunctions to either or both of 2 older children to get up. There is no mention of a man in the household, and the woman is struggling to manage with a baby to care for and unhelpful older children. She cannot undertake any paid work because of the time taken to look after the baby. There is also a suggestion that there are elements of the family experience which are displaced, while the birds in the bush and the trouts in the burn, which are their proper places, the sheep would not normally be found in the meadow, and the cattle should certainly not be amongst the corn. But despite the difficulties of her life, the mother still seems to find some degree of solace in singing.
So she follows this with a critique of Bruce and Stokoe, the compilers of Northumbria Minstrelsy, their interpretation of the song as a pretty picture of family life, which
hardly does justice to the themes raised in the song, which recur over the centuries. The struggle faced by unsupported women, the challenges of raising children, and the longing for the stability of things in their proper place.
I did check up one thing. You do let sheep into meadows, but only after you've cut the hay. And then the danger of putting them in earlier is, well, read Far from the Madding Crowd and you get an idea of some of the dangers. That's a bit of a side note. Okay, so let's deal with the ideal woman. Here's the conclusion of the ideal woman chapter.
While there were many songs in the Northeast between 1790 and 1850, which encouraged women to display the characteristics of sweetness and passivity and idealized those who did, this was not the only representation of women available. Some of the songs which portrayed a different view or challenged stereotypes might have had a restricted audience, but others were reprinted often enough to suggest that people wanted to hear them. Perhaps some women and men would have enjoyed a degree of fellow feeling with those whose activities they pursued themselves. Others may have heard such adventures with some wistful interest in those who pushed out the boundaries of respectable society. And doubtless there would have been those who derived pleasure and satisfaction from the opportunity to disapprove.
Some of those Puritans that Paul mentioned. Okay, so let's just consider briefly some other aspects. There's a chapter on sex and seduction. This is mainstream stuff in traditional song, isn't it? Female subjects vulnerable to seduction. It's just a widespread theme, and the importance of honor and the importance of keeping a good name, a reputation. Add to that the difficulties of having illegitimate children, of course, and this is where the poor law comes in, because again, Hardy's a good thing on this. Think of the poor woman who's got off with Sergeant Troy, who just ends up at the workhouse. So there's a lot of injunction against women's, to look after yourself, don't be seduced. I mean, I love this little bit from the Bell manuscript, it's only a fragment. Mind, lassie, what you do, and mind what you do, never let a sailor lad get to bed with you. Pretty direct and pretty straightforward and pretty good advice, I think. Interesting, in this section, most of the songs were found in Bell's manuscript rather than his published work. His book of the time was The Rhymes of the Northern Bards. And the implication of this is there's perhaps some self-editing, some self-censorship going on, even in around 1810, 1812. So the other thing is that when in the material Susan looks at, there's relatively little negative judgment. Quite surprising in some ways, but then a lot of sympathy for women who get in that position. Working women is another theme. Many references in the song. Some of the women in Tyneside songs are boisterous and confident. I love the song called The Quayside Shave. They used to shave people on Newcastle Quay, which was actually probably one of the densest populated parts of England at that time in the 18th and early 19th century. And Ned Corven's song of the Cullercoats Fishwife. Here this is interesting. She's not just going to make sort of cheap feminist points, if you like, because she criticises Harker. He says that Alan is a fairly rapacious businessman who makes a bit of money out of Tyneside Song, although of course his book is very important. He's a stationer, printer, publisher, and so on. His 1891 edition of Tyneside Song has transformed her from a fishwife to a fish lass. And according to Harker, her former robust, self-confident and extroverted personality gets moderated to a curious and unnecessary insistence on her being sexually pure. The original uninhibited woman is rendered in Alan's version as a mawkish, prissy caricature. But
I think Harker overstates his case here, and he gives the example of her reference to being pure as a dewdrop as one demonstration of Alan's modification of the text, while in fact it is Corven's version that this description is found. Nevertheless, there are certainly differences in the two versions which merit consideration in relation to the representation of working women.
And she goes on to consider those points. So the idea of a well-kept home, obedient, faithful and sober wife is certainly there in songs. A wife should kiss him often, cuddle him well, call him your heart's delight, and give him 3 good meals a day and a quart of ale at night. I mean, other songs, though, deal with discord. This is the failure to really fulfill wifely duties. Washing Day is a wonderful, thump thump, terrible, atmosphere in the house upon a washing day. Insufficiency of money comes up in poverty is an absolute reality of life. Love and domestic violence come up in a few songs. The Sandgate Wife's nursing song. When Daddy's drunk, he'll take his knife and threatens sore to take my life. Who wouldn't be a keelman's wife and have a man like Johnny? Now, Susan brings fascinating insights into this song and the attitudes expressed.
It is difficult for those with no experience of domestic violence to understand how a woman can go on loving the perpetrator, which makes none's appreciation of the feelings of this keelman's wife all the more interesting, and his recording of the situation commendable.
Okay, so the last chapter, I'm not going to go into detail here at all, but it's a sort of potpourri of various things where women get involved in struggles and songs about public life, civic action generally. It's very interesting, and if you want some attitude-for women, look up Euphy Scott and Peggy Potts. They're quite wonderful. Okay, so reflections and conclusions. There's a range of female experience. All the way from abused wives to loving wives, to idealized women, to absolutely self-confident and boisterous women, aristocrats to poor whores. Songs reflect the urban life. I mean, these aren't on the whole, except some of the earlier stuff from Bell and so on. These reflect Newcastle and Gateshead as this great bustling centre.
As the attitude to women's participation in paid work changed, this was reflected in some North East songs. However, this may be a quirk of Alan's editing, and there is scope for further research in this area.
We've always got to get round the editors in some way. But Susan does document significant changes in musical life after 1850. I've mentioned this before. the local song, pub singing and so on gives way to a larger age of music hall and so on. The problem of the influence, the songs are interesting, but the influence is still something we discuss to this day, and it remains a crucial and an undecided area. The cycle of stereotyping we find in the songs.
This is a model in which a particular representation of a group is repeatedly presented as true or valid, which reinforces the belief that the original representation must therefore be true.
If you say a thing often enough, people come to believe it's true. This reminds me of a certain American president, but I don't want to dwell on that. So the songs speak to the everyday lives, the realities of common people. Now, I have put Susan's dissertation on the Internet Archive. I can send this whole set of slides to anybody that wants them, but here are important references. I've also got 6 of Dave Harker's books. I talked about that earlier. The Farn Archive is a wonderful resource. It's a bit clunky and a bit in need of updating. Harker's 2 books of the John Bell collection and minor songs derived from that are not available online. They're going to be, but the Surtees Society, which has existed for over 100 years, is not fast in getting things done. I think it's scheduled fairly soon. Northumbria Minstrelsy is online, as is Rhymes of the Northern Bards, but you can search a lot of other material. Just put things like Newcastle songs, Tyneside songs into the attention. It's really good if you read Susan's work with the text, but reading Susan, you will be enriched and stimulated. Thank you very much for your attention. I've got to
Thank you, Vic. Excellent, as always. I'm afraid we are running a bit late, so
sorry, I went on a bit.
That's all right. It's not your fault, Vic. We won't have time for questions, but please do email Vic and Sheila if you've got anything to say. I must point out 2 things. I met Susan when I was doing my children's folklore book. She arranged for me to go up there and meet some local children and interview them, so on. So I underline the fact that Susan really was a really nice person. But Vic, you made a terrible mistake in that presentation. You said that Bonnie at Morn is Round 3.
Oh no.
3604. It's really 3046. So,
dyslexia strikes again.
Yeah, so number is wrong, people. Get your numbers right. Okay, we're going to move on to Steve Thompson, who is, as I say, is new to us. Are you there, Steve? Do you want to share your screen? Okay, we have that. Excellent. No, we did have it, but it went again.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute before I then started the presentation, and so couldn't see where to unmute, but I'll try that again.
That's the shortest presentation we've ever had. Yeah,
is that okay?
That's good.
That's great, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you this evening. It really is a privilege to join you and to share a bit of my work on ballads and disability in Victorian Wales. I am a historian. I work in a history department, and so I do feel I am trespassing in other people's areas here by doing so. But I do think that ballads have a great deal to offer historians, and that's come through quite clearly in the other papers as well. So hopefully then this paper also complements many of the things said in those papers. Okay. This ballad here, Mwynwr Tlawd, written by a miner injured while working underground in Monmouthshire during the 19th century, is a very good example of the ballads that are featured in this paper today. In its explanation of the experiences of disability, its attention to the emotional consequences of impairment, its narrative of the individual's life before becoming disabled, and its consideration of the effects on the family, the ballad is typical of those referring to disability in 19th century Wales. As I want to show then, ballads are a very rich source for historians that can contribute something valuable and unique to the studies of disability in the past. And I have been involved in different disability history projects, primarily a large collaborative project with colleagues in Scotland, the northeast of England, and in South Wales that looked at disability in the British coal industry, focusing on the coal fields in those areas. In that particular project, one of the problems that we encountered was trying to get first-hand perspectives from disabled people themselves and disabled workers. But I did use then ballads as a means by which to try to access the first-hand accounts then of disabled people and their experiences in these industrial communities. As you'll see in this paper, a number of 19th century ballad singers were indeed disabled. And singing and publishing ballads was a response to their disability, partly due to their lack of other options within the economy and in the industrial economy especially. At the same time, and in addition, the ballads allowed disabled people to represent themselves and their experiences of life. And so ballads, as literary sources, also offer representations and understandings of disabilities that were current within these communities during that period. Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain to this audience, but it is worth noting, of course, that the ballad culture in Wales in the 19th century was very vibrant. Ballad singers were important individuals throughout the country, relaying information about the latest news and the most interesting events, entertaining listeners with their performances and their social commentary. In fact, ballad singers in Wales were described in Welsh as newyddiadurwyr y glenydd, the journalists of the hills, to offer a literal translation, because of their role in disseminating news across the country. And indeed, of course, these journalist ballad singers, very similar to ballad singers elsewhere in the British Isles and beyond, took their colourful ballads about murders and executions, mining disasters and shipwrecks, suicides and love stories, elections and strikes, elegies and tributes to every community in Wales. They were often itinerant, moving from place to find audiences for their songs and sheets, singing on street corners, or better still, calling at fairs where greater numbers of customers could be found. None of this will come as any surprise to any of you, I'm sure. It's very much the sort of culture of ballad singing then in the 19th century across the British Isles. Large crowds, and this is obviously a very famous image, not necessarily relevant to Wales, but I don't doubt communicating something that was witnessed in the country and in these different fairs then and on street corners. Large crowds gathered around these singers then to hear them. In Welsh, they were sometimes described as cantorion y cerdd ceiniog, the singers of the one-penny songs. People gathered around them to hear their latest works on some horrific murder or catastrophe in a coal mine, and purchased their ballad sheets as well. Now, ballads during the 19th century touched upon a broad range of topics, and some of them did indeed include attention to disability. I've come across a good number of ballads relating to disability, some 20 or more, something like that, some of which relate to industrial disability as a result of accidents in the coal, iron and slate industries in different parts of Wales, while another group deals with blindness, both in terms of congenital blindness or acquired blindness on the one hand, and blindness as a result of industrial accidents on the other. Disability then, relative to other kinds of topics that crop up in ballads, is not a significant theme in ballad culture, just taken by numbers alone. But there are sufficient numbers of songs then to offer some ideas and conclusions about disability and ballads, and to understand something about disability in that period, I think. In my opinion, ballads have the potential to offer new and exciting perspectives on 19th century disability then. In her article on Writing the History of Disability, Elizabeth Bredberg notes that so-called folk and so-called experiential sources, as opposed to institutional sources, have the potential to produce a history that avoids generalization and that foregrounds the perspective and subjectivity of the disabled person. In addition, Bredberg makes the point, of course, that experiential autobiographical sources are rare and tend on the whole to come from the higher orders within society. Ballads, it's clear, were experiential sources that offered first-person perspectives based on experience and were created by poor and working-class people. They were very much part of that plebeian culture, of course. It's difficult to research the lives of ballad singers, Quite often all we have are the broadsheet ballads themselves or some fragments about those ballad singers in other source types. Nevertheless, we know many of them were disabled. Here, for example, is Dick Dywyll, Richard Williams from Anglesey, a blind ballad singer, and his bardic name Dick Dywyll indicates that. Dywyll is the word for dark, which can be taken to mean blind. And we know very well indeed that Dick Dywyll was indeed blind. He was a very famous ballad singer, located himself in Merthyr Tydfil, the iron metropolis of the first half of the 19th century. Such was his power in that town. He was described as the Emperor of China, and China was the sort of slum district of Merthyr at that time. Well, one of his ballads about the new poor law in the 1830s was so scathing in its criticism, it was given as the reason why nobody dared build a workhouse in Merthyr until 20 years later in 1853. But Dick Dywyll, perhaps the most famous ballad singer, is obviously disabled as well through blindness. And we can see from other names or bardic names of these different ballad singers in Wales that they too were disabled or indeed blind at that time. So among the more famous of ballad singers at that time was Levi Gibbon, a Drew Dash, the blind wren, Abel Jones, a Bardd Crwst, David Jones, Dewi Dywyll, again Dywyll indicating blind, David Davis Ddall, that's blind David Davis, and then there's Lewis a Goes Bren, Lewis the wooden peg, the wooden leg. So just by these names, we know of a good number then of ballad singers who had some disability or another. Most in this group blind, just because different kinds of words were used then in their bardic names to indicate their blindness. In addition to that, not just, the names are indicative, but in addition to that, of course, many of the ballads themselves offered autobiographical material on the impairments and disabilities suffered by ballad singers. So here, for example, are two different ballads. Now I've translated the titles into English so that you can get a sense of what they're about. And then in other slides, I've translated some of the lyrics as well, some of the words of the ballads then, in order to indicate something of the content. So the first of these two ballads here, Munwr Tlawd again, Poor Miner. The ballad singer relates his experiences underground when he damaged his spine due to an accident. In the second of these two ballads, Coin a Cloth, the layman's complaint. The ballad explains how he left Cardiganshire in West Wales, rural Cardiganshire, to go to work in industrial Glamorgan before he had an accident and then lost his leg. The ballad is really, really interesting because it even contains a long, quite horrific description of 3 doctors holding him down and amputating his leg, all, of course, without any anaesthesia at that time. The autobiographical treatment of the cause of disability comes through in the ballads sung by blind ballad singers too. So again, 2 more of these ballads. So Levi Gibbon, Drew Dall, the blind wren that I mentioned earlier. This is his particular ballad explaining how he became blind at that time. So in that one, he describes the various things he remembers seeing before becoming blind, and how he lost his sight at the age of 25, despite the efforts of several doctors. In the second case here, Benjamin James, he recounts how he lost his sight as a result of an accident working in a quarry in the parish of Gelligaer in South Wales. So this would have been a stone quarry rather than a slate quarry, and he lost his sight as a result of an industrial accident. He was igniting the powder in a hole in order to bring down some stone, and that sort of blew back and took his sight from him then. We can also see in the Slate Quarrying district of Northwest Wales instances, again, in which industrial accidents took the sight of workers who then possibly became ballad singers, or else created these ballads then as part of as part of an effort to try to raise some money to try to make ends meet subsequently. These ballads, as you would imagine, illustrate the hardships that came with disability during the 19th century. Due to the lack of opportunities for people with disabilities in the economy at that time, many individuals turned to singing ballads as a way to make ends meet. So it's quite common to have this kind of verse appearing in these ballads, in which they are explaining to the listener of the ballad or to the purchaser and reader of the ballad sheet exactly the kinds of challenges that they were facing in making ends meet and providing for their families. So we get these kinds of stanzas very, very often within these ballads. Again, a few more examples of that. So a cantor Dash, the blind singer, describing then the extent to which his wife and children are dependent upon him and on him alone. So again, he's emphasizing his role, isn't he, as the breadwinner of the family, his role as head of the family and his responsibility to his children and wife, in order to try to prick the conscience of those who are listening to his song or else reading this ballad in order to provide some money for himself. Similarly, in Coin a Clove, the lame man's complaint, he's staying very, very carefully. He's making very clear that he is looking for some sort of financial recompense from the listeners then to help him on his way. Now, this was very evident, of course, to the listeners as singers explained their family situations and the need to earn a living. Ballad singers, of course, were eager to receive the pennies of appreciative listeners at their fairs and along the roads they travelled, and were not afraid to use shame or attempt to shame their listeners in order to encourage donations. So again, Cwyn Van Thomas Jones from Carnarvon. This is somebody who, as you can tell from the title, was deprived of his sight by a chill and a pain in his head in 1847. And here, as is true of many of these ballads, especially in the 18th century, but also into the 19th century, the kind of religious faith and the religious understandings of these, the religious claims then for philanthropy and charitable support comes through very, very clearly. Again, trying to prick the conscience then of those hearing these songs in order to provide something for the families. So I think then for all these kinds of reasons, the ballads that refer to disability are extremely interesting and can help us understand the situation and status of at least some disabled people in Wales during the 19th century. And more importantly, their experiences of life, perhaps. It is possible for historians to use ballads as a primary source to find out something about the hidden history of disabled people in this period. This, though, is not the end of the utility of ballads for historians studying disability, because it is also possible to use ballads as literary sources to focus on the understandings of disability in the period and the ways in which disability was portrayed. Fortunately, literary studies as an academic field has been far better than history in addressing disability in this regard, offering far more theoretical kinds of approaches that have proved very, very useful. So here, for example, is Rosemary Garland Thompson, a scholar who has studied disability in American literature and especially novels. As you can see, she has argued that disabled people in novels become a discursive construct, informed more by received attitudes than by people's actual experience of disability. But these people nevertheless remain on the margins of fiction as uncomplicated figures or exotic aliens whose bodily configurations operate as spectacles, eliciting responses from other characters or producing rhetorical effects that depend on disability's cultural resonance. That is, that ideas about disabled people can be constructed through literature and other media, or become fixed portrayals that are used as literary devices for the sake of the novel, rather than constituted accurate, sensitive portrayals of the reality of impairment and disability. Ballads, on the other hand, offer a different perspective, of course. Ballads offer portraits of disability articulated from the perspective of the disabled person, and are therefore autobiographical and personal in nature, very often. Neither the impairment nor the individual are abstract or mere devices for narrative purposes, but instead they are foregrounded, creating an image of disability based on personal experience, articulating subjectivities, without mediation by someone else, hopefully. In addition, ballads contain the normalizing aspects of the ballad singer's lives through attention to daily needs, family relationships, hopes, concerns and emotions, and indeed the reactions of other people, all of which are subordinated to the literary intentions of the novelist in literary portrayals. So ballads then is far more useful perhaps to historians, or useful in very different ways to novelistic treatments of disabled people. They offer insights into the personal lives of disabled people, and it's possible to see them as these disabled ballad singers, to see them as sons, fathers, husbands, and so on, instead of just an impairment. The ballads emphasize how similar they were, despite their disabilities, to their listeners. So we get lots of different kinds of instances of this type of thing, where the ballad singer is reminding the listener or the reader that they are very similar to them themselves in different kinds of ways. Again, it's an attempt perhaps to create some sort of identification between disabled and non-disabled people, to challenge perhaps misunderstandings about disability and impairment in society at that time, and to bridge that gap between able-bodied and impaired people. At the same time, of course, ballad singers could not go too far in that regard. They also had to suggest how their disabilities made their situation different and difficult in order to elicit sympathy and to encourage listeners to be kind. So a further stanza here in this particular ballad emphasizes the difficulties faced by Unreliable, the blind wren, through his loss of sight, in order, of course, then to prick the conscience of those listening and to elicit some sort of financial support. The ballads, therefore, in these different kinds of ways, humanize disabled people for listeners. They explain the experience of life of disabled people for those who are not disabled. They suggest the similarities to other people as well as their differences, and convey the personality and emotions of the ballad singer. And those emotional aspects of ballads raise another issue that has been extremely important in literary studies of disability, namely melodrama as the mode used to portray disability in 19th century literature. Here, Martha Stoddard Holmes shows how the melodramatic mode was used to portray disability in novels, autobiographies, and other media in the Victorian era, and suggests that melodrama was used to elicit an emotional response among readers. She sees autobiographical sources, such as ballads, as a personal counter-narrative of identity that is different from the stories the dominant culture tells about your experience, but one that is inevitably fashioned with reference to the melodramatic conventions that permeated cultural constructions of disability. So we can see kind of instances in this in a great many different kinds of ballads. So again, the Cantor Dash, once again, the blind singer, William Bowen, and his experiences. He's explaining what life was like before he experienced blindness, how similar he was to those kinds of individuals, but through misfortune, is now no longer able to see in quite the same way as everybody else. This individual, Cantor Dash, he worked in Cyfarthur and Dowlais, so iron making towns in Glamorganshire, moved across to Ebbw Vale then in neighbouring Monmouthshire. He describes also in this ballad the hard work within those iron furnaces, but also the ways in which the way in which molten metal splashed in his eyes and caused him to become blind. But we can see the kind of melodramatic kind of approach being taken here then, that really does try to motivate the conscience of the listener and the ballad paper purchaser in order to support him financially. Ballad singers also utilised the cultural power of an idealised childhood and the cultural power of mothers in melodramatic ways to provoke powerful emotional responses. So here, Cwyn y Dall, the blind person's complaint. Again, he's thinking about the ways in which he was able to see previously, and the things that he did witness as a child and a young man growing up, but which are now no longer available to him as a result of his blindness. And those kinds of references then to these different aspects of his life, again, very characteristic of the melodramatic mode here. This counter-narrative, yeah. Again, if we think in another kind of way then, again, utilising the melodramatic mode, we can see the ways that these disabled ballad singers were emphasising the fact that they were more than just their disabilities, that they continued to have critical faculties in a range of other kinds of ways, and that they were, again, not dissimilar to other people in these regards. So again, it's trying to do away with the kind of stigma of impairment and disability. It's trying to convince other people that these are just like them. At the same time, certainly it was hard to escape the melodramatic mode during the period. It was so very, very powerful. But in addition, of course, the ballad as a form encourages melodramatic material. It is intended, ballads are intended to provoke a strong emotional response, aren't they? Even without the power of the melodramatic mode influencing them in any way. So that melodramatic mode was a very powerful influence, but it was also valuable to the ballad singer just because of the way in which ballads worked in that kind of context. So just to finish off then, ballads, I think, are a particularly good source on the cultural history of disability. The connections between disability and ballads are numerous and quite complex. They can tell us about the particular lives of individual ballad singers who locate their impairments and disabilities in the context of a lifetime, with focus on the time before and after incurring an impairment, and all the different aspects of their family lives before and then after as well. Also, ballads are forms of representations that have consequences for the ways in which society makes sense of disability, and we can learn a great deal from studying these different representations. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're over time, but it would be nice if there's a couple of comments or questions, if anybody wants to make them, if they're quick ones. I've got a quick question, Steve. These were all in Welsh. Were there English broadsides of this ilk as well, or were this sort of thing always in Welsh?
I've been working through kind of Welsh collections, so collections in different Welsh archive repositories, but also some privately owned kind of collections locally. All of the ones related to disability, then, they are all in Welsh alone. Other ballads on other matters going later into the 19th century are often bilingual. So they'll have 2 pages in Welsh and then the same content in English on the next 2 pages. So I've not come across any on disability that include English versions as well. They are just in Welsh. And I guess if you think about the first half of the 19th century and into the middle part of the 19th century, the Welsh language is still extremely strong. Very large proportions of the population monoglot Welsh speakers. There wasn't much need to produce English versions as well. That changes with the linguistic shift towards the latter decades of the 19th century, and especially in South Wales. And so you do get more bilingual ballads related to colliery disasters in South Wales, for example, just because the population is more linguistically mixed.
Right, thank you. If any more? I don't see any other questions. No, okay. So thank you very much to our 3 speakers today. They all hung together. They had a sort of theme, as if we planned it. It was an excellent session. Thanks very much for the speakers. Thanks for coming. And we will see you in December the 7th. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks for coming.